actor Paul Mescal might be playing Paul McCartney in the new Beatles biopic movie, or the series of Beatles biopic movies that are going to be coming from director Sam Mendes. And this is coming from a bunch of different sources. It's originally coming from The Hollywood Reporter, that is reporting that director Ridley Scott said that Gladiator II, his star from that movie, Paul Mescal, who's an up-and-coming actor. I haven't really seen him in too much, but he's in that new movie, Gladiator II. He's kind of the Russell Crowe of that movie. They're saying that he's lined up to play Paul McCartney in the upcoming Beatles biopic movies, or series of movies, like I said, from director Sam Mendes. This was actually announced earlier this year that they're going to be making these series of Beatles movies, 4 individual Beatles movies that are going to cover the Beatles' careers, their individual stories, and then lead them up into essentially a team-up movie that's going to be, I don't know, like the Beatles Endgame or something like that. It's kind of like an Avengers-style team-up. So Ridley Scott says that he heard that Paul Mescal is pretty much lined up to do the Beatles movies as his next project. Again, kind of an indirect source coming from Ridley Scott, who's not really directly involved with this Beatles biopic movies or series of movies, but somebody who might be a little bit more in the loop is Ringo Starr, the Beatles drummer, who said that Barry Keoghan, who's been a bunch of different things all over the place, would be playing Ringo Starr in the Beatles movies, which makes sense because definitely Barry Keoghan has a little bit of that Ringo Starr look to him. And I think that Paul Mescal can pull off Paul McCartney. I don't really think for these biopic movies that the look of the character has to be exactly like the person in real life. I feel like that would be kind of difficult, even though they've done it for plenty of biopic movies in the past. So like I said, it's these individual movies that are leading up into this thing called, whatever, like I said, the Beatles Endgame or the Beatles Infinity War, whatever you want to call it. But this is a little bit of a weird topic for me. Like, where do I even start? I have to say, hate is a strong word, but I very much dislike biopics about musicians. Don't get me wrong, I do enjoy them about other types of famous people, whether that be actors or people who are famous for other various things. But I absolutely hate, I'm just going to go out and say it, I hate movies about musicians, because I always feel them to be very, very cliche. They always tend to follow the same rock and roll movie tropes that most movies tend to follow. And when I think about some of the more recent biopic movies that have been released about musicians, we had Bohemian Rhapsody, which I have not seen. That movie looked atrocious. Rocket Man, the Elton John biopic movie. Back to Black, the Amy Winehouse biopic movie that came out earlier this year, which looked absolutely horrible. That was not a good idea at all. And then there's another one coming out this month. I think it might already be in theaters or coming out in wide theaters very, very soon. And that's the movie A Complete Unknown, which is the Bob Dylan movie starring Timothée Chalamet. So I don't think I'm really that interested in biopic movies, whether it be any of those ones, although there are some ones in the past that have been released, and maybe it's because there are maybe more low profile characters that are featured in that. And that would be Backbeat, which was a 1994 movie, which came out with Stephen Dorff, which he starred as Stuart Sutcliffe, which was kind of an exception because Stuart Sutcliffe was a member of the Beatles who died very young, was not there when the Beatles made it famous. And that's the story that we don't really know as well. We know the Beatles story. If you're a fan of the Beatles, you know the ins and outs of the Beatles story very, very well. I've been reading or rereading Tune In all these years, which is the first Beatles volume from Mark Lewison, which covers kind of the Beatles' career leading up to 1962 when they first signed the record deal and they're on the cusp of becoming the biggest thing ever. That was a great book by Mark Lewison. And we know all the facets of that story. And then I really loved Weird, which was the Weird Al Yankovic movie starring Daniel Radcliffe. And that was really because they took the piss out of the Weird Al story, right? So there wasn't really, it wasn't really taking itself too seriously, which a lot of these musician biopics tend to do. And with that Stuart Sutcliffe movie, it was like an exception because it was covering a lesser known member of the Beatles who passed away very, very young, had a great soundtrack, which featured Dave Grohl on drums on that one. So there always, there have been some good biopic movies made about musicians in the past, but then they always tend to, like I said, distill those moments moments into a few very cliche moments. I can just picture a scene in the Beatles movie when they eventually do team up for the Avenger Beatles or whatever they're going to call it. The band's going to be working in the studio. They're going to be at Abbey Road. They're going to be working on a song. It's going to be a long day. And then Ringo says, as I'm sure he said in real life, because this is a total Ringoism, he's like, oh, it's been a hard day's night, eh, fellas? And then, John and Paul Mescal as Paul McCartney and whoever's going to play John Lennon sit up and be like, Ringo, what did you say? What was that? Oh, it was a hard day's night. And then bang, they write the song there in the studio. Of course, they have to have the obligatory scene where they're singing at the mic with their hands on their headphones, like, it's been it's just going to be cheesy. I tend to think that a lot of these biopic movies distill these really complicated moments. It's not to say I've been in a band at the level of the Beatles, but I've been in a band and it's very creative and you're spending long hours in the studio trying to make things sound right. It's not necessarily always the most glamorous process, even though the result is an amazing product, this amazing music that the Beatles gave us. But when you try to put that into a doc or into a biopic movie, sometimes it's a little bit hard to swallow. But then give me a music documentary any day. If you really want the definitive story of the Beatles, then I think you should probably go watch the Beatles anthology, which is not really readily available on streaming. It's one of those things that you might have to find in a discount bin at a DVD store or something like that. But the Beatles anthology really covers the entire Beatles story with interviews and stuff from the band, with the actual music, with the footage, which would be a lot better, infinitely better than watching some sort of biopic movie. And then you had the Beatles 64 movie, which dropped on Disney Plus over the last couple of weeks, which is another documentary about when the band first hit America in 1964. So there are better sources for Beatles content, for the story of the Beatles, other than these biopic movies. Again, I haven't seen them. I don't know if they're going to be good or bad, but I love the Beatles, but I hate biopic movies. So I'm very torn about this, although I think, not that I have a good sample size of his work, Paul Mescal, I'm sure would make a great Paul McCartney, Barry Keoghan as Ringo Starr, whoever they get to play John Lennon, whoever they get to play George Harrison. I'm sure they'll do a good job, but very torn about that. And we'll see if Paul Mescal can pull off playing Paul McCartney in the eventual Beatles biopic movies, which I don't think are due out for a while. I think 2027, is the release date. So we don't have to hold our breath on that one. So